The fluorescent lights hummed overhead at Seattle General, a sound Margaret Walsh had stopped noticing 8 years ago. She stepped through the employee entrance at 10:16 p.m., her badge clipped to the pocket of her scrubs, her posture upright, her hands steady as they had been for 2 decades. The night shift was hers again, the cardiac unit, beds for through 9, the patients no one else wanted after sundown. Nobody looked at her as she passed the nurse's station. Nobody ever did. The hospital smelled like it always did, antiseptic and stale coffee and something underneath both, something like surrender. Margaret changed into fresh scrubs in the locker room, the old ones discarded into the bin. She opened her locker, number 247, third row, and her fingers found the object she kept there without thinking. A surgical glove, tied at the wrist. Inside it, wrapped like a secret nobody was supposed to keep, a challenge coin from Tikrit. The metal was tarnished almost black. The unit insignia was still visible if you held it to the light, which Margaret never did. Not during daylight hours. Not when anyone could see. She tucked it back into the far corner of her locker and closed the door. Some things belonged in darkness. The cardiac unit was quiet when she arrived. Margaret moved through the corridors with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact task 5,000 times before. Chart review. Medication reconciliation. For site assessment. Her movements were efficient, her notes precise, her presence barely a ripple in the surface of the ward. She was the kind of nurse younger staff did not ask questions of because she did not volunteer answers. She was the kind of nurse senior residents did not respect because she did not demand it. 8 years of night shifts had made her invisible in the way only competent people could become invisible, by doing exactly what needed to be done and asking for nothing in return. Bed 7 was Admiral Richard Hastings. Navy. Retired. His chart said coronary artery disease, post-stent placement, admitted for routine follow-up. Margaret pulled the curtain and approached with the dressing change supplies already organized on her cart. His dressing was 5 days old. It would be replaced with something fresh. The Admiral's forearm was scarred with ink that age had faded into something almost unreadable. Margaret had seen it before. She saw it every time she changed his dressings, which she did every week, which meant she had seen it 40 times, which meant the faded letters on his skin were as familiar to her as the lines on her own palm. Walsh. Just that. The letters were loose and spreading like they had been done quickly, in field conditions, probably, though Margaret never asked. She did not ask patients questions about their tattoos or their scars. She changed the dressing. She adjusted the monitor. She made sure he had water within reach. "Thank you," Admiral Hastings said, his voice the texture of someone who had given orders for 40 years and would give orders until he could not speak anymore. "You're welcome, sir," Margaret replied. Her voice was soft. Even. The voice of someone who knew her place. She finished the dressing change in 4 minutes. Tape secure. No inflammation at the site. Sinus rhythm steady on the monitor. Everything normal. Everything as expected. She moved to the next bed without hurrying. The night shift had the rhythm of a heartbeat, long stretches of quiet punctuated by moments of sudden need. At 2:13 a.m., Margaret checked on a post-MI patient whose oxygen saturation had drifted down to 88%. She adjusted the high-flow nasal cannula to 6 liters, watched the number climb, 91. 94, 96. Stable. At 4:22 a.m., she caught a medication error from the pharmacy, a dose that did not match the patient's weight, before it reached the fall line. At 5:51 a.m., she sat with a woman in her 70s who was afraid of dying and held her hand without speaking until the woman fell asleep. This was nursing. This was what Margaret did. Nobody watched. Nobody applauded. Nobody knew her name beyond what was printed on her badge in letters that had faded from repeated washings. The shift was supposed to end at 7 a.m. That was when the day staff arrived. That was when the attending physicians began their grand rounds, the ritual performance where senior doctors led teams of residents and medical students through the hospital, presenting cases, teaching lessons, demonstrating their command of medicine and of the people who worked beneath them. Margaret had been present for 2,847 grand rounds over 8 years. She knew how they worked. She knew when to speak. She knew when to stay quiet. She knew, above all, that nobody wanted to hear what she thought. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 6:58 a.m., moving through the cardiac unit like he owned the building. He probably thought he did. His reputation was polished and bright, innovative billing practices, strong relationships with device manufacturers, a network of grateful colleagues who received consulting fees for work nobody could quite define. His suit was navy blue, tailored, expensive. His watch was gold. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never doubted anything in his life. "Walsh," he called out, and Margaret turned from the medication cart where she was preparing morning doses. Not even a greeting. Just her last name, spoken like a command. "Grand rounds. Now." She set down the syringe and followed him without argument. The team assembled in bed 4. 8 people. Residents in their second year of training. Medical students still learning how to fit the stethoscope into their ears correctly. Dr. Caldwell positioned himself at the head of the bed like a general addressing troops. Margaret stood slightly behind the group, where she would be visible but not prominent. Where she could answer questions if asked. Where she would not intrude on the actual teaching. This patient, Dr. Caldwell began, presented 3 weeks ago with a negative troponin and mild chest discomfort. A classic presentation. An expensive presentation, if you are not careful. He turned toward Margaret. His eyes had the brightness of someone about to make a point. "Tell them, Walsh. How many unnecessary diagnostic tests did you recommend before Dr. Bennett reviewed the case?" Margaret did not blink. "I recommended none, Dr. Caldwell." "Exactly. Not a single recommendation for advanced imaging. No stress test. No additional EKGs." He smiled at the residents. "This is outdated nursing practice. This is the cost containment of an earlier generation." He turned back to Margaret. 12 lead EKG, troponin panel, complete metabolic workup. All of them indicated in a patient presenting with risk factors. Your hesitation to escalate care is exactly what prevents physicians from making the definitive diagnosis our patients deserve. The resident snickered. Margaret heard it in the way people heard background noise. She registered it, but she did not react to it. Her jaw remained loose. Her hands remained at her sides, steady, open. She looked at the patient in the bed, not at the residents, not at the doctor. She looked at Admiral Hastings, who was watching her with an expression she could not read. "The chart is available for review," she said quietly. The patient had resolved symptoms by the next clinical assessment, which could have been prevented with proper diagnostic work, Dr. Caldwell replied. He did not wait for her response. He moved to the next bed, and the group followed him like he had pulled a thread and everyone else was attached to it. Margaret remained still until they had cleared the unit, and then she returned to the medication cart. The morning continued. Day shift arrived at 7:15 a.m. The night staff gave report. Margaret passed her patients to Nicole, a nurse 2 years out of school who had energy and ambition and did not understand yet how little it mattered. By 7:24 a.m., Margaret was walking toward the parking lot, her shift finished, her contribution to the hospital complete and already forgotten. The air outside was heavy. Rain was coming. The sky over Savannah had turned the color of old bruises. Rain hammered the Seattle General parking lot like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. Margaret Walsh stood at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, waiting for her coffee to dispense, when Dr. Caldwell rounded the corner with 3 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. He hadn't seen her yet. That was about to change. "Margaret!" His voice carried the tone of someone addressing a piece of outdated equipment. He stopped beside her, blocking the machine's light. At 34, with silver threading through dark hair that cost more to maintain than Margaret's monthly car payment, Caldwell had the look of a man who'd never been told no. His resident shifted nervously, sensing what was coming. They'd seen it before. "Doctor." She didn't turn from the machine. Her coffee cup filled slowly. "Patient." "Steady. I was just wondering something." He adjusted his pressed white coat, the one with his name embroidered in italic script. "And I genuinely love your input here. Do you think some people are simply too old to adapt to modern healthcare economics? Or is it more of a generational resistance thing?" The coffee cup filled. "Half full now. Because I've been reviewing your patient charts, 8 years of them, by the way, quite the archive, and it occurred to me that you might not even be aware that the healthcare landscape has evolved considerably." He turned to his residents. "She still documents vitals with a pen. On paper." In 2024. One resident smiled. The other two stared at their shoes. Margaret retrieved her cup. The machine hissed as it released the last drops. She turned to face him then, her eyes level, her face a geography of stillness. No flush in her cheeks. No tremor in her hands. Just a woman holding a hot cup of coffee, waiting for him to finish. The protocols you're familiar with, the conservative approach, let's call it, they're costing patients, Margaret. They're costing the hospital. They're costing us innovation. But I understand. Change is hard at your stage of career." He stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, something with notes of cedar and expensive desperation. "Have you considered whether it might be time to step back? Make room for people who understand where medicine is headed?" She raised the cup to her lips. Took a slow sip. The coffee was still too hot, but she didn't flinch. "No response?" He smiled. It was the smile of a man used to winning. "Well, I suppose that answers that." He walked past her, his residents scurrying behind him like ducklings, their white coats snapping against the fluorescent-lit hallway like surrender flags. Margaret stood at the vending machine for another moment, coffee cup steady in her hands, her breathing unchanged, her pulse exactly where it had been before he arrived. She'd learned composure in places where a single visible reaction could cost lives. A condescending doctor was not a threat. He was barely an inconvenience. She moved back into the ward. Bed 412 needed his dressing changed. The 4 in 408 was running slow. There was work to do. Always work to do. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 hours later, when the night shift hit its quiet point, that strange 2:38 a.m. calm when even the machine seemed to hold their breath, and Margaret was restocking the medication cart outside the surgical supply room. Dr. Caldwell appeared with hospital security. With Marcus Chen, the head of security. With papers in a manila folder that made Margaret's practiced composure finally register as something more than mere indifference. "Ms. Walsh." Caldwell's voice had changed. It carried the weight of institutional authority now, the kind that came from phone calls made in his office, from favors called in from the hospital board president, from regulatory contacts who'd taken his money for years. "We need to discuss several HIPAA violations that have come to our attention." Margaret set down the 4 bags she was holding. Turned. Waited. Patient information has been accessed without clinical necessity. Charts opened during non-shift hours. Specific details about Admiral Hastings' medical history, details you have no reason to know. He opened the folder. Inside were printouts. "I hate to be the one to bring this, truly I do, but we have a responsibility to patient privacy. Security may need to escort you from the premises pending an investigation." "That's not accurate." Her voice was quiet. Precise. The voice of someone stating a fact, not defending herself. "Your login shows." "I haven't accessed any patient chart outside my assigned duties." She looked at Marcus Chen. "You can verify the access logs. They'll show every login corresponds to a time I was assigned to that patient's care." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. He was a decent man, ex-military, had served in Fallujah years ago. He knew bullshit when he heard it. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Well, regardless, we'll need you to step back while we investigate. Standard procedure. Am I being suspended? Temporarily reassigned pending. That's suspension. Margaret moved past both of them, returning to her medication cart. I'll finish the night shift. I'll document my last medication administrations. Then I'll go home. Security will escort. No. She didn't raise her voice. She simply continued working, her hands steady as surgical lasers, her movements economical and practiced. You need a valid reason to remove me from the floor. You don't have one. So I'm finishing my shift. Marcus knows that's how this works. She pulled an 4-bag from the cart, a 500 milliliters normal saline, and walked toward the ICU without waiting for a response. Behind her, she heard Caldwell's voice rise, heard him saying something about cooperation and investigations, heard Marcus tell him quietly that he was right, that Margaret needed to finish her shift. The sound of Caldwell's expensive shoes retreating down the hallway came next. Victory of a sort. The kind that tasted like ashes. For the next 6 hours, Margaret moved through Seattle General like a ghost that could touch things. She changed dressings. She monitored drips. She documented vitals with a pen on paper, just as Caldwell had mocked. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. But at 3:22 a.m., when she was alone in the supply room gathering bandages and antibiotic ointment for Admiral Hastings' arterial line dressing, she felt the weight of the tarnished challenge coin in her locker across the hall. The one wrapped in a surgical glove. The one she hadn't looked at in daylight in 20 years. Tickrit. That's what the coin meant. That's what the faded name on Hastings' forearm meant. That's what 8 years of working night shift at Seattle General meant. She was here because she was supposed to be dead. Because in 2004, Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had extracted a CIA asset from a compound in Jolin District and had been ordered to disappear. Burned. Dissolved. Officially, she had died in that operation. The Navy had been very clear about what would happen if she surfaced. Very clear about the consequences for anyone who knew she'd survived. And now, somehow, she'd attracted the attention of a fraud artist with more ambition than sense. A man who wanted her gone badly enough to fabricate charges. A man who was making phone calls at 3 a.m. to people with power. She finished gathering the supplies. Returned to the ward. Tended to Admiral Hastings with the same careful precision she always used, her hands moving through the ritual of care, a saline wash, fresh dressing, security check of the line, while he slept and the machines around him counted out the minutes of his recovery. At 6:27 a.m., when her shift ended, Margaret changed out of her scrubs and walked to her car in the early morning darkness. The rain had stopped. The sky over Savannah had begun its daily transition from bruised to merely tired. She drove toward home on roads that knew her route by heart, her hand steady on the steering wheel, her mind exactly where it needed to be, nowhere. Nowhere at all. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors. The intercom crackled at 2:56 p.m. Code blue. Trauma Bay 3. Routine cardiac procedure gone wrong, which meant it wasn't routine anymore. Margaret was changing linens on the 4th floor when the overhead announcement hit. She didn't rush. Rushing meant panic. She folded the sheet she was holding into a perfect square and set it on the cart. Then she walked toward the stairs with the same measured pace she'd maintained for 8 years at Seattle General. The surgical theater was already chaos when she reached the doors. Admiral Hastings lay splayed open on the table, his chest a geography of blood. The attending surgeon, a man named Petrova with 15 years of cardiothoracic experience, stood frozen 3 feet from the bleeding field. His hands hung at his sides. Around him, 2 residents and a scrub nurse moved in fractured motions, no coordination, each person waiting for someone else to take command. Dr. Caldwell stood near the monitors, his face pale under the surgical lights. He'd been observing the procedure, playing senior attending, and now his mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The hemorrhage was catastrophic. Not slow. Not manageable. A massive arterial bleed that meant the surgeon's initial intervention had gone wrong, the vein had been nicked, or worse, the arterial repair had failed under the pressure of the Admiral's own heartbeat. Blood loss at this rate meant for minutes. Maybe 5 before the cardiac output dropped below any point of recovery. Margaret stepped through the doors without changing into fresh surgical gear. Protocol violations. Contamination risks. None of that mattered when the room already held the smell of copper and panic. "Step back," she said. Not a request. Not a suggestion framed as medical deference. A command delivered in a voice that had once directed evacuations under mortar fire in the Jolin district, where the buildings came down in sections and you had 90 seconds to move 17 people through rubble that was still falling. Petrova's eye snapped to her. The resident nearest the suction trap froze. The scrub nurse's hands trembled. "I said now," Margaret continued. She was already moving toward the table, her eyes cataloguing the hemorrhage site, assessing the damage with a precision that belonged nowhere near civilian medicine. The bleeding came from the left anterior descending artery, the LAD, where Caldwell's initial intervention had caused a dissection. The arterial wall had split like overripe fruit, and now the Admiral's blood was filling his chest cavity faster than anyone could suction it out. Petrova stepped back. Not because he understood who she was. Because her voice had the weight of absolute authority, and humans respond to that even when they don't understand why. Margaret cracked the chest. Her hands moved on their own. 20 years since Tikrit. 20 years since she'd done emergency resuscitative thoracotomy in the field. Her fingers found the ribs, and the surgical saw, a striker cordless oscillating saw sitting on the instrument tray, came into her palm like it had never left. She opened the sternum with 3 clean cuts. The saw's whine filled the room. Around her, she sensed Petrova stepping further back, his face shifting from panic to something else. Recognition, maybe. Or the dawning realization that this nurse was not a nurse at all. Blood poured. She suctioned. Type O negative. 2 units. Push the first one now. The scrub nurse moved. Finally. The resident reached for the blood. Margaret's fingers entered the chest cavity. Direct access. Direct pressure. She placed her palm against the bleeding point and compressed. The LAD laceration was 3 centimeters. The dissection extended into the descending aorta. Not survivable in the field. Barely survivable here. She began the compression. Not the gentle compressions of external cardiac massage. Open cardiac massage. Her hand working directly against the heart muscle, felt and bone and the terrible specific warmth of arterial bleeding contained only by the pressure of her palm against the tissue beneath. "I need a 4.0 proline suture," she said. "Needle holder. And get me a satin sky clamp." Petrova was still watching. The residents had gone quiet. The scrub nurse moved with the precision of someone who had finally understood that the person in charge knew exactly what she was doing. 30 seconds of continuous compression. The monitor showed a flat line still. No electrical activity. No perfusion. Just her hand, working in the geometry of his open chest, pumping blood through his coronary arteries by force of will and muscle memory. Second line. Push another epi. 1 milligram 4. The medication went in. Margaret didn't pause her compressions. Pain was information. The resistance of his heart under her palm told her the organ was still viable, still responsive. The flex and give of the tissue. The temperature dropping gradually as his core body temp plummeted despite the 4 fluids running wide open. She'd done this once before in a NATO-controlled hospital in Kandahar. Never successfully. The patient had coded 5 minutes in, and she'd called it at the 7-minute mark. But that was different. That was a gunshot wound with exit trauma that couldn't be repaired. The Admiral had a technical problem. An arterial dissection. A surgical failure that could be fixed. The satin sky clamp went on. She positioned it across the damaged section of the LAD, clamping the bleeder without crushing the entire vessel. The blood flow slowed. Then stopped. 65 seconds of continuous compression. O2 sat, she asked. 42, the resident said. Voice shaking. Get it moving. Increase the vent to 18. Get me the proline. Now. Her other hand moved while her primary hand continued the compression. She threaded the needle with a precision that shouldn't have been possible while performing open cardiac massage, while her other hand was wet with the Admiral's blood, while the entire surgical team watched a nurse perform surgery that surgeons were trained for and she was not supposed to know. 70 seconds. Sat climbing, the resident said. 48. 51. The sutures went in. 1. 2. 3. Each one placed under her continued compression, her fingers working in the space between her own palm and the damaged artery. Microsurgery while performing resuscitation. The kind of thing that got you thrown out of nursing school. The kind of thing that got you classified when you'd learned it in a combat setting where classification was the only way to keep the technique secret. 85 seconds. 64, the resident said. The oxygen saturation climbing like a plane that had just cleared the runway. 68. 72. 76. Margaret sutured the artery closed. Full repair. The kind of work that belonged in a surgical textbook, not in the hands of someone who'd been treated like outdated equipment for the last 8 years. She could feel the moment the bleeding stopped. The suction trap fell silent. No more blood pouring into the cavity. The color of the heart changed under her palm. The desperation drained from it. Just a muscle again. A muscle that had been bleeding to death 5 minutes ago. 91 seconds of open cardiac massage. 82, the resident whispered. 85. 88. Close, Margaret said. She stepped back. Her hand came away from his chest. The surgical team moved like they'd been waiting for permission. The surgical resident reached for the closing instruments. Another set of hands. The attending surgeon, Petrova, was staring at her with an expression that made the fluorescent lights overhead seem darker. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breathing. The rhythm of the cardiac monitor. One blip. Then another. Then the solid beep-beep-beep of a sinus rhythm returning. The Admiral's heart was beating on its own. Margaret stepped back from the table. She'd been in his chest for 3 hours. Continuous compression. Suturing. Pressure. Triage protocol. Field dressing in a surgical theater. Everything she'd been trained to suppress, everything that was buried in the classified files that didn't exist anymore, had poured out of her like she'd never stopped being a combat medic at all. She didn't look at Dr. Caldwell. She didn't acknowledge Petrova's expression. She simply stepped away from the table and began removing her surgical gloves. One finger. Then the next. The latex made that soft snapping sound as she pulled them free. Behind her, the surgical team sprang back to life. Suturing. Closing. Monitoring. The routine work of people who no longer existed in a moment where everything had shifted. Where a nurse, an invisible, outdated nurse who'd been scheduled for termination, had just performed emergency thoracotomy with the precision of someone who'd done it before. "You need to change," Margaret said to the scrubbed nurse. Her voice was already settling back into the measured tones of the 8-year veteran. The command voice was fading. Not disappearing. Never disappearing. But settling back into the shadow where it had lived all these years. She walked toward the scrub sink. Around her, nobody moved. Not for 3 full seconds. Then gradually, the sound of the surgical team resumed. The beeping of monitors. The soft pad of booties on tile. The hiss of suction. But there was something different in the room now. A weight. An awareness. The attending surgeon stared at her hands as she washed the Admiral's blood from her skin, watching it spiral down the drain in pink-tinged swirls. His eyes held a question that had no answer she could give him. Not here. Not in Seattle, General. Not in a city that was supposed to be where she disappeared. What they didn't know was that Dr. Caldwell had already made the first call before she'd even stepped out of the OR. His hands were shaking as he reached for his phone in the hallway. His network of pressure was already activating. His allies in administration. His contacts at the state licensing board. The investigators he'd cultivated over years of carefully distributed contributions to campaigns and charities that required favors in return. He was going to destroy her for this. And he had no idea who he was standing next to. The monitors shifted to sinus rhythm at the 3-hour mark. The entire surgical team exhaled at once. Margaret's hand stayed steady as she released the heart, watching the organ contract on its own, the electrical impulse firing where minutes ago there was nothing but catastrophic hemorrhage. Attending surgeon stepped back. Nobody spoke. The silence in that OR was the silence of people who just watched someone pull a man back from the actual edge of death. She stripped her gloves. Surgical mask came off. The lights above hummed their fluorescent song as she turned toward the scrub sink, and that's when she saw him through the observation window. Dr. Caldwell. Standing perfectly still. Watching her with the expression of a man watching his entire institutional control evaporate in real time. His phone was already in his hand. Margaret washed her hands methodically. Each finger. Between the knuckles. Up to the elbows. The water ran warm, then hot. She didn't hurry. Behind her, the surgical team was already moving Admiral Hastings toward recovery, already calling the post-op protocols, already giving her the space that competence demands. She dried her hands on a paper towel and pushed through the OR doors into the hallway. Dr. Caldwell was already on his first call. "It's me." She violated protocol in the OR. Practicing beyond her scope. "I want her terminated before end of shift." His voice was clipped. Practiced. This wasn't the first time he'd made this particular conversation. "No, I don't care if the Admiral survives. She's a liability. Call the licensing board. Tell them we're filing a formal complaint." Margaret walked past him toward the locker room. His voice followed her down the corridor, already dialing the next number. The board president. The state licensing authority. Investigators he'd cultivated over years of carefully distributed campaign contributions, building a network of pressure that operated like hydraulics, apply force at the right point and the entire institutional weight shifts. He was competent that way. Dangerous that way. By the time she sat down on the bench in front of her locker, the machinery was already in motion. The locker was small. 8 years of hospital shifts compressed into 8 cubic feet of gray metal. Her name on a handwritten label. M. Walsh. Nothing underneath to suggest who she actually was. A spare pair of scrubs. Compression socks. The tarnished challenge coin wrapped in a surgical glove at the bottom, the one she never examined during daylight hours, the one she'd carried since 2004 when they told her to disappear, when they burned her records, when they said Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had died in Tikrit and would never surface again. She was reaching for the coin when the hospital security officer appeared in the doorway. Young guy. 26, maybe 27. Nervous energy about him. "Ms. Walsh? You need to come with me." She didn't ask where. She already knew. The conference room on the administrative floor smelled like coffee that had been sitting for 4 hours and the particular brand of fluorescent despair that only corporate healthcare facilities can manufacture. Hospital Administrator Mitchell sat at the head of the table with her file open in front of him. 17 pages. 8 years of performance reviews that said competent and reliable and nothing else. Margaret took the empty chair across from him and folded her hands. "You performed a procedure tonight that was outside your licensure," he began. "I performed emergency intervention on a patient in cardiac arrest. Open thoracotomy. Direct cardiac massage. That's a surgical procedure, Ms. Walsh. You're a registered nurse. You don't have the authority. The surgeon stepped back. The patient was in arrest. There was no other option. There's always another option. He closed the file. You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Your badge access is revoked as of 1906 hours. That was 20 minutes ago. It wasn't a request. It was a command. She stood up. Walked back to the locker room with the security officer flanking her like she was a flight risk. Opened the locker. Removed the spare scrubs. Folded them. The coin stayed in her pocket. The badge came off her neck. The credential that said she belonged here, that said she had the right to walk these hallways, that said she existed in any institutional sense at all. She placed it on the bench beside the folded scrubs. Is there anything you want to say? The officer asked. No. She walked out through the employee exit, past the ambulance bay where the rain had started falling in earnest, past the parking garage where her 2008 Honda Civic was waiting in its usual spot, row J, space 47. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. The rain hammered the windshield like it was trying to get through the glass. Like it was trying to warn her about something. Her phone had 6 messages. All from the hospital. All official. All termination notices stacked on top of each other like dominoes falling in slow motion. She drove home through empty streets, her hands moving the steering wheel the way they'd moved a human heart 3 hours ago, steady, competent, the way hands move when the rest of the brain has already separated from the situation. The apartment was dark when she got there. Her daughter, Sarah, was at her girlfriend's place. Good. Margaret had maybe an hour before Sarah came home, an hour to process the fact that 8 years of invisible service had just ended in the span of one phone call, one decision, one moment of medical competence that had been classified as a crime. She sat down at the kitchen table in her civilian clothes, still wearing the hospital ID badge that had already been deactivated, and something broke. Not her composure. Composure was a tool she'd mastered in Tikrit. Composure was a weapon. Composure was the thing that had kept her alive when officials told her she was dead. What broke was the careful separation between Margaret Walsh, the invisible nurse, and Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, who had carried a wounded Admiral for miles through enemy fire, who had extracted a CIA asset under mortar rounds, who had been ordered to disappear and had spent 18 years doing exactly that. The sobs came from the place where those two identities met. Where the invisible person couldn't hide anymore. Where 8 years of built-up weight finally exceeded the capacity of professional restraint. She was sitting there, shoulders shaking, hands pressed flat against the kitchen table when her daughter Sarah came through the door at 11:23 p.m., home early from her girlfriend's, carrying take-out containers and the kind of exhausted happiness that only 23-year-olds can manage. She stopped in the doorway when she saw her mother. "Mom? You're home." Margaret couldn't answer. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Sarah dropped the take-out containers on the counter and crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, her hands finding her mother's shoulders, and for the first time in 8 years, Margaret Walsh let someone else see the weight. "What happened? What's wrong?" "I lost my job." "What? How?" "You just..." "I did everything right. And it wasn't enough." The rain continued outside. The kitchen light hummed above them. Sarah's arms wrapped around her mother's shoulders and Margaret let herself be held for exactly 47 seconds before she felt the first vibration, distant, rhythmic, the sound of something heavy moving through the night sky toward Savannah. She didn't hear it at first. She was too far down inside her own collapse. But Sarah heard it. Sarah pulled back, looking toward the window. "Do you hear that?" The sound grew louder. Then louder. The distinctive whump-whump-whump of military helicopter rotors cutting through the rain, the sound that every military family knows in their spine before they know it in their ears. Margaret's head came up. Her eyes went to the window, to the darkness beyond, to the place where the sound was coming from. She could hear it now. Could feel the air pressure change as something massive approached the residential neighborhood where nobody ever had any reason to arrive by air. "Mom, what is that?" Margaret Walsh didn't answer. She stood up from the kitchen table, and for just a moment, the civilian nurse disappeared. What replaced her was someone else entirely. Someone whose hands had held lives together. Someone whose sobs had stopped as suddenly as they'd started. Someone whose spine had straightened and whose eyes had found the distance of people trained to make decisions under fire. "Stay here," she told her daughter. Outside, the rain hit the pavement in sheets. And somewhere in the darkness above Savannah, something was landing. The fluorescent lights of the Seattle General Conference Room buzzed with the kind of electric tension that precedes collapse. Margaret sat in a plastic chair, her discharge papers already processed, already final. The hospital board chairman had scheduled her termination review hearing for 11 in the morning, 3 days after she'd saved Admiral Hastings's life. 3 days of silence. 3 days of her daughter asking questions she couldn't answer. 3 days of staring at that tarnished challenge coin and remembering why she'd buried it in surgical gloves at the bottom of her locker. The administrator was mid-sentence about scope creep and liability exposure when the ER doors burst open down the hallway. Not emergency sirens. Not a code blue. Something slower. Something deliberate. Margaret heard it before she saw it, the screech of a wheelchair, the bark of a voice that didn't sound like a patient. "Where is she?" The room didn't change. The administrator didn't stop talking. But Margaret's spine straightened in a way that made the hospital lawyer glance sideways at her. "Admiral Hastings is in stable condition," the administrator continued, not looking up from his notes. "That doesn't erase." "I said, where is she?" The doors to the conference room swung open. Admiral Richard Hastings sat in a wheelchair, his left arm wrapped in fresh bandages, but his eyes were moving like a man scanning a battlefield for a target. His jaw was a line of corroded steel. Behind him, in the doorway, stood a security guard Margaret had seen around the hospital, young guy, maybe 30, with a kind of bearing that didn't come from private security training. It came from combat zones. His name tag read Clayton, and his eyes had just landed on Margaret's face. He went pale. "That's," his voice cracked. He cleared his throat. Started again. "That's a Master Chief Petty Officer, sir." The room froze. The administrator's pen stopped moving. The lawyer's head came up slowly, as if she'd heard a sound that didn't quite make sense in her normal world. Margaret felt the weight of their attention like a change in air pressure. Admiral Hastings wheeled himself forward until he was directly across the table from her. He didn't speak. He just rolled up his sleeve. The letters were faded, the ink run together like watercolor left in the rain. Walsh, her name, tattooed on his forearm in script that had been blue once, maybe 20 years ago. The skin around it bore the marks of shrapnel scars, small pale crescents where metal had torn through him and healed badly. "This woman," he said, his voice dropping into the register of command, "carried me for miles through Tikrit. Fallujah Corridor, 2004. Insurgent fire from 3 positions. She had 2 other men on her shoulders, both bleeding out, and she was calling in air support on a radio while moving through broken concrete and carbine fire. I was a lieutenant commander then. I owed her my life. I have owed her my life every single day since." The administrator opened his mouth. Closed it. The lawyer was staring at Margaret now, and Margaret could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, reassessing. Recalibrating. The door opened again. This time it was a man in dress blues. 2 stars on his shoulder board, each one the size of a thumbnail. A general. He walked into the conference room like he owned the building, which meant he probably did. Behind him came 2 people in dark suits, the kind of dark that came from federal buildings. The general was holding a file folder, the kind of file that probably had Margaret's photograph on the first page, her real photograph, the one from before she became invisible. "Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh," he said, not reading, not looking at notes. He knew her name. He knew her rank. The way he said it made it sound like an order of magnitude. Bronze Star for Valor, 2003. Silver Star for Leadership Under Fire, 2004. 2 Purple Hearts, 1 in Anbar Province, 1 in Helmand. And a Navy Cross for the Tikrit Extraction of Asset Designation Charla 7. Each medal landed like an artillery round against everything Dr. Caldwell had built. Each one a direct contradiction of outdated nursing practices and scope creep and liability exposure. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside pressing against the windows like something alive trying to get in. The Navy Cross, the General continued, is awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. Not in a cardiac unit. Not in a hospital bed. In actual combat. Which means, Administrator, that you have just attempted to terminate a decorated military officer for performing emergency medicine at the exact level she is trained to perform. Dr. Caldwell wasn't in the room. Margaret knew that instantly by the absence of him, the way the space felt lighter. He was somewhere else, probably making phone calls, probably trying to activate whatever network of favors and pressure and carefully cultivated relationships he'd built over the years. But it wouldn't matter. Not anymore. The doors opened again. This time it was the hospital board chairman, and behind him came investigators with badges, and behind them came local news cameras with their red eyes blinking. The camera lights made everything look like surgery, stark and white and clinical. The board chairman looked at the administrator the way a superior officer looks at a private who's just made a catastrophic error. Dr. Caldwell is no longer employed by this institution as of this moment, he said. His voice had the tone of someone reading a court order. His medical license has been suspended pending investigation into kickback arrangements with Hexel Medical Supply, MedTech Solutions, and Precision Imaging Corporation. The state licensing authority has received documentation of fraudulent billing codes dating back 8 years. The Department of Justice is opening an investigation into conspiracy and wire fraud. He is being escorted from the building now. As if on cue, they could hear it, a commotion down the hallway. Raised voices. The sound of a man's protests being overridden by federal agents who'd heard much worse. The squeak of shoes on tile. The jingle of handcuffs. The sound of a career ending. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the conference room doorway, flanked by 2 agents in dark jackets that had special agent printed across the back in letters so white they looked like they were carved into the fabric. His face had gone the color of bad milk. His eyes were moving too fast, like he was trying to calculate which direction to run. "This is a mistake," he said. His voice was trembling. "There's been some kind of—" "You are under arrest," one of the agents said, not looking at his face. Not giving him the dignity of eye contact. "For conspiracy to defraud, wire fraud, and obstructing a federal investigation. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." They handcuffed him right there in the doorway. The metal clicks were sharp and final. His colleagues stared. The nurses who'd come to watch in the hallway looked away. The younger staff members took out their phones. By the time they escorted him past the windows, the local news was already broadcasting live. Local doctor arrested in healthcare fraud scheme. Margaret watched his face as they led him away. Watched the moment when he understood that the network he'd built, the calls he'd made, the pressure he'd activated, none of it would save him. The military audit his own pressure campaign had triggered had uncovered everything. 8 years of markup schemes and kickback payments and inflated procedures that had quietly stolen money from insurance companies and government healthcare programs. 8 years of him building a house on sand, not knowing that Margaret's existence as a witness would eventually become his prosecution. 6 months later, Margaret walked into Seattle General wearing her dress blues for the first time in 20 years. The uniform fit like a memory, snug at the shoulders, the creases sharp as a salute. Around her neck hung the Navy Cross, bronze and austere, the ribbon a pattern of red and white. She was walking to her new office, Director of Emergency Medicine, Department of Military Affairs and Trauma Response. The hospital had created the position specifically. They'd called her at home to offer it. She'd said yes while her daughter watched, finally understanding why her mother had those scars, finally understanding what that name in her mother's locker meant. In the break room, someone had taped up a news article. Former Dr. Caldwell now selling supplemental insurance. There was a photograph of him outside a grocery store in Tucson, Arizona, standing behind a folding table with brochures spread out like wounded animals. His name tag read Steve, which was close enough to his first name that it was probably a violation of some non-compete clause somewhere. He looked smaller in the photograph. Diminished. The kind of man who'd once intimidated residents and nurses and entire surgical teams, now watching people avoid his table as they walked past on their way to buy milk and eggs. On her desk, in a frame made of dark walnut wood, sat two things. The tarnished challenge coin from Tikrit, finally brought into daylight. And beside it, a photograph of her daughter in Navy uniform, fresh from the Naval Academy, pinning on her own ensign's bars. The same uniform Margaret had worn. The same path. The same lineage of service that had started in the darkest part of a desert 20 years ago, when a Master Chief Petty Officer with Margaret's name had carried wounded men to safety and been told to disappear. She had disappeared. But not into silence. She disappeared into medicine. Into nursing. Into the quiet work of keeping people alive, night after night, while the world watched the doctors and ignored the hands that actually held the sutures, that actually checked the vitals, that actually knew when something was wrong. She'd made herself invisible because someone in the Pentagon had ordered her to. And in being invisible, she'd become stronger than anyone knew. Margaret checked the monitors in Trauma Bay 1. A patient was stable, already improving. The respiratory therapist looked at her, not at the chart, not at the monitor, but at her directly, waiting for the decision. Waiting for the command. Margaret nodded, and the therapist moved without question. This was what authority looked like when it was earned. When it was backed by scars and sacrifice and the knowledge that this woman had survived things that would break normal people into pieces. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the restraint it had taken to stay quiet for 8 years while a charlatan mocked her. The restraint it had taken not to respond to every insult with the truth. The restraint of a person who understood that power used too early is power wasted. She'd been just a nurse. Now she was the director. But the scrubs under her dress blue still smelled like antiseptic and human blood and the particular exhaustion that comes from saving lives. And that was the part that mattered. That was the part she kept. Good work, she told the respiratory therapist. Go take a break. That's an order. The therapist smiled. Almost no one smiled at work anymore. Almost no one understood that a break wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. It was the decision to stay sharp by resting when it mattered. Margaret would have told you something then, if you'd asked her, standing there in her office with the challenge coin glowing under the fluorescent lights. She would have told you that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. She would have told you that invisible doesn't mean powerless. That silence doesn't mean acceptance. That scars tell stories to people who know how to listen. But you'd have to ask. She wouldn't offer it. That was how you survived in the dark. That was how you waited. That was how the strongest people on Earth learned to live in a world that didn't know they were there. Until the day it did. Like and subscribe if you love stories about people who've been underestimated. Comment below if you've ever had someone doubt you and you proved them wrong. Let's get back to it.